welcome to everyone that is joining me for this presentation on global leadership and global citizenship education. Let me share just a little bit about myself. I'm based here in Tokyo, Japan. I am a professor in the field of leadership studies. And to be honest, I never intended or planned to travel to work abroad. And it all sort of came 10 years ago. I received an invitation, just over 10 years ago. I received an invitation from Soka University to join them as the founding dean for the Faculty of International Liberal Arts. And so I decided to take a deep breath and to cross the ocean. And not knowing anyone and not speaking Japanese, I arrived in Hachioji, which is Western Tokyo. My connection to leadership, however, was not new. My connection to leadership spanned 3 decades. And I had served in leadership positions in city government, state government, and as the executive or president of 2 different nonprofits that were both statewide and national. And I thought I understood leadership, at least in a Western context, which I didn't even define at that time. Well, I arrived in Japan, the first female dean and the first non-Japanese dean at my university, and it forced the question. It forced this question: what does it mean to be in a leadership position in a global context? Now, I knew that I understood leadership practice in a US context, but now I had to really put myself forward and begin to reflect on how would I navigate these very rocky waters. And so in this presentation, what I would like to do is present to you a perspective, perhaps a new perspective, for how to understand and consider global leadership. I had the fortune to be able to listen to the global debate that happened earlier in the conference. And I felt like they cued my presentation because the final question in the global debate around global citizenship and national identity, the final question was, what type of leadership will we need in order to advance global citizenship education? So I hope that this short presentation will begin to shed some light. Let's go to the next slide. So what I wanted to start with is a traditional perspective on how we approach problem solving. And the Sustainable Development Goals are a good example. So we start by naming goals. In this case, 10 years ago, we named 17 of them. We look at goals, we then set outcomes, and then we have deadline dates. That is common, that's traditional. But if we look to the left of this small image, you see an arrow pointing to the process. What is often left out is what process will be needed in order to be able to do that work of goal setting, achieving outcomes, and fulfilling the goals promised. I would suggest to you that reality sometimes does not marry well with strategies. And so if we look at the next slide, we begin to see that traditionally, leadership has been examined from a very transactional perspective. And that's one of the first leadership models that I understood. It then began to bring in conversations about inspiration and influence. And then many people, many organizations began to lean towards transformational leadership. So the idea that a leader could inspire and, in fact, bring transformation to the followership and to others in the work environment. What I would posit and suggest to you is that leadership can expand beyond this. And there are multiple leadership models, but many of them are based on competencies, skills, and traits. And what I would like us to consider is moving from competencies to resonance. Resonance is an approach to leadership that begins to value human relationships above all. And if we go on to the next slide, we will see that what we're doing now is beginning at least with a simple definition of global leadership. Even for global leadership, there are multiple, dozens of definitions. But what I like about this working definition is that it contains the perspective of informing one about multicultural, and I would add to that multilingual paradigms, and that this process of global leadership is paradoxical and complex. So, if we want to be able to employ global leadership, it's not only A to B, but it's A to B and then Q and then maybe something in kanji and then maybe something in Hangul, right? So it begins to bring about this perspective of complexity. And we'll see that in the next slide. I'm suggesting that we go from global leadership to unpacking it and begin to consider this concept of global resonance. Now, global resonance begins to connect and hold up the value on human relationships. And it begins by framing some questions that on the surface seem fairly simple, but imagine trying to get to in depth answers on these questions. The first one is, who are you? One of the educators that I love, Parker Palmer, says we teach who we are. And I would suggest to you that we can apply this model to leadership. We lead as we are. So it is relational, it is context based, it is culturally based, and it is informed by those crucible experiences that have shaped you. So we ask not only who are you, but what has shaped you? What have been those crucible experiences, those transformative experiences? And this leads then to considering how might you be your best self in relationship with others. So you can already see from these three opening questions that this approach to global leadership based on this concept of resonance is starting with you, asking you to be able to reflect and consider your best self and what would allow you to get to that point. So let me share a story with you. We go to the next slide. Today, here in Tokyo, it's already evening. This afternoon, I taught my global leadership course. Global Leadership and Dialogue is the title of this course. And in this course, we examine in the first half of the semester the lives of 12, 13 Nobel Peace Laureates, examining their lives, their leadership experiences, in order to be able to understand the complexity of global leadership. And for today's classes, we were finishing this first half of the semester and the textbook that we had been studying. I asked my students to think about what three values framed their lives, what three values mattered to them. And they took a moment very quietly and fretted about what those three values might be. And then I asked them to stand, to walk around, to stop, to pick a partner, and to pair and share, to take 1 minute each to share, to say something about those values. And the first sharing happened. And then I said, all right, keep walking, take a breath, keep walking, and find your next partner. And they began again. They began to share. What I didn't tell them was that I was reducing the time that they were having to share. So the first time they had 60 seconds. The next sharing, I rolled it down to 50 seconds. And there was an intention in doing this. By the third time that they shared with a new partner, so this is now their third partner, they had 30 seconds. Now, the power of this exercise is not in the naming or the selection of those values. The power of this exercise is in the sharing. Being able to share very succinctly with a partner and a new partner and a new partner what matters to them, because that's how I understand values. It is a reference, a capturing of what matters to me. And as students debrief the exercise, I love that someone said and introduced the word resonates. He said, I began to resonate. I could see how my values resonated with this other person. And this idea of resonance became a metaphor within the class. And it was perfect because it's this idea that it's like the strings on a guitar. And when one string vibrates, the other three or four or five or eight strings also begin to vibrate. It happens with a violin, it happens with a harp, with stringed instruments. This idea of global resonance. Imagine that when you exchange and relate with another human being, that you are in the process of creating resonance. And so, this metaphor of the guitar, of the strings vibrating, really begins to capture how I understand relationships. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that global resonance begins to frame on these founding elements of it's an intention to connect with another human being. So global resonance is absolutely about that connection, but it's not just a random connection, it's an intentional connection. It also is framed on the base of cultivating a global identity. Now, I am of the belief that we as human beings are framed by multiple social identities. So, for example, my social identities include identifying as female, as Latina, I'm a mother, I'm a practicing Buddhist. Those are all social identities that I connect to, identities that frame my sense of belonging in the world. It also begins to influence my practice of knowing and doing, how I show up in the world. And in leadership jargon, we talk about a leadership presence, your executive presence. This ability to connect with your global identities begins to shape and frame that presence. And of course, it requires not you working solo, but being in relationship with someone else. And so if we go on to the next slide, we see that what is the pathway for connecting? And I'm going to suggest it's dialogue. Now, we don't have time to go in depth into this, into explaining this pathway, but I'm going to pull out two important points here. One is the art of dialogue requires the practice of listening much more than the practice of speaking. Somehow we've gotten this confused that when we hear dialogue, we say, oh, that means talking. And honestly, it is much more than that. And I really want to raise the understanding of dialogic learning, dialogic engagement, that it's a process of transformation. It's being willing to exchange, to listen, to open up. And so it not only requires the art of listening, but also to prepare for the dialogue means preparing yourself. So if we go on to the next slide, you'll begin to see that we're taking this pathway of dialogue to global resonance. And now we're framing questions. So at the beginning of the presentation, I should have said I'm probably going to leave you with more questions than answers. But I really do believe that the heart of global leadership, the heart of global resonance, and the heart of global citizenship education is in this forum of inquiry. So here, global resonance, the first question I would ask you to consider is why or what is it that you want? What do I want or need in order to be in this relationship? What do I need? Right? So all of a sudden, it's not asking, what am I going to get out of connecting with someone? I mean, that's sort of the social capital perspective. This perspective is asking, what do I need in order to be my best self in this relationship? It also begins to ask one to consider, what is your truth? Think about that for a second. How would you answer that? What is your truth? And how can your truth inform or distort what you expect and what you will experience? It's valuing the fact that we are not empty vessels, that we come to relationships as complex human beings, and we are contributing as much as we are receiving. And a third question that I would offer for your consideration is, what would make it possible to invite transformative dialogue in order to be able to inspire shared learning? So, my whole premise here is that global leadership requires relationship building. Relationships matter, context matters, culture matters. And it's this process of dialogic engagement that allows us to begin to explore, experience, and learn. And if we go to the next slide, these are the questions. If we had time, and if you were in my class, these are questions that participants have shared or explored in the past. The idea that when we allow ourselves to answer these questions in the parent share dynamic, imagine someone asking you, what is your truth? And then you having 3 minutes. That's all, just 3 minutes to respond, uninterrupted, no questions asked. What is your truth? And then for you to then continue by sharing, and how does this truth inform how you connect with me or with someone else? So this idea of global resonance is really pushing you to that edge where you're going to have to look in. You're going to have to look in order to look out. And if we go to the next slide, now I walk that bridge over to global citizenship education. And I want to preface this by saying, whenever I hear GCE, I always add the word critical in front of it. And it's because I am a practitioner of critical pedagogy. I am a deeply seated fan of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator. I am wanting to walk this pathway by asking questions, by challenging the system, the level of engagement, questioning power. Where does the power lie? Who has the power? The source. Where does this problem, this issue arise from? Around engagement, who's missing? Whose voices are missing? So, critical global citizenship education begins on this premise. And if we go to the next slide, we see that now the challenge is to be able to unlearn, learn, and relearn. Unlearn our prior understanding of leadership. I like asking my students at the beginning of many of my leadership classes, I'll say, all right, take a moment and name 3 leaders. Inevitably, I would say 99.9% of the time, the leaders that are named are male, middle-aged males, and usually in positions of power, elected positions. Yeah. And what I've come to understand is that our concept of leadership is so often tied to position. Now, in one of the earlier sessions, I think it was in the global debate session, one of the debaters, excellent speaker, she said, everyone can be a leader. And I agree 90% with that statement. The other 10% says, while everyone can be a leader, maybe not everyone should be. And I'm just going to pause and leave that one there. But the idea here is this approach to global leadership will require us to unlearn, learn, and relearn some of the concepts that we have of power, even of global citizenship education, and of the concept of leadership. And if we go to the next slide, I want to share that in doing this work with students, now hundreds of them, doing this work with hundreds of conference participants, what I am understanding daily is that this reconceptualization of power and agency begins to frame and undergird what I now understand as global leadership and global citizenship education. So Reconceptualizing, what does that mean? Well, in the words of my students, one student said, and this was in response to being invited to share reflections at the end of the semester. The student said, redefining the meaning of power was the most impactful and brought me hope for the future. All of a sudden, power was not negative, but it was something that they could construct. Another student said, I learned that we have the right to construct new meaning. I encourage my students to construct new knowledge. And I think this is the basis of moving forward on this new pathway. And let me share another story because I want to leave time for a few questions. My own family story. My parents immigrated from Mexico, the state of San Luis Potosí, to the United States as migrant workers. When they came to that country, to the US in the 1950s, 1 out of 10 people was a person of color. Now we fast forward to the year 2024. Today in the United States, 1 out of 4 people is a person of color. In my students' lifetime, in 30 short years, by the year 2050, 1 out of 2 people will be a person of color. Now, just imagine that transformation of place and space. And then I ask the question, what kind of leadership will be needed in order to continue to move our societies forward, our sense of community forward, our sense of self? I am absolutely struck with this idea of resonance, that when I can resonate with you, when I allow myself to be in relationship with you, it allows my own complexity to emerge. And I believe that this conference, the International Conference on Transformative Education, is an enormous step forward for helping us all begin to examine the complexity of these human relationships. Our job as global leaders is not to simplify and silo our complexity, our identities. Our job is to heighten our level of comfort with this complexity. Global leadership depends on it. Thank you so much. And so I'm going to stop there and take a breath. I'm going to ask everyone to take a breath. And as we look at global leadership built on global citizenship, all stemming from global resonance, I'm going to check to see if we have questions. And so the first question, I'm going to look at the question first, and then I'll go to the chat. So a couple of questions. The first question is, how has SOCA education or value creating education influenced my own sense of global citizenship? Value creating education is a pedagogical approach to education, to a system of learning that focuses and, in fact, values relationships. It's the idea that we can create value in this learning circle. It connects to dialogue. So dialogic learning is central to value creating education. And I would say that it is central to who I am as an educator. It's about seeing the dignity of life in every student in front of me. It's understanding that I will learn as much as I give in that teacher-learner relationship. And it's being able to question, what is my own capacity as an educator for allowing my students' full potential to emerge? So in response to your question, it has shaped every thread in my body because it is how I approach the world. The next question from Nitesh is, could you please share a little bit about spirituality and leadership? That is a wonderful, wonderful question. I often, in my leadership seminar course, actually this past week, I framed the question for them: what's the difference between spirituality and religion? And we were able to explore how Spirituality really begins to address our own presence on this planet, our own understanding of spirit. And different life philosophies call it a different terms. Some call it a soul, some call it your essence, your Buddha nature. There are different ways to address it. What I would say in response to that question is that leadership, in fact, is drawn from one spirituality, and spirituality different than an organized religion. And I think that that question, who are you, is in fact based on your own connection to sense of self, a very deep self, for wanting to understand how we relate to each other in this on this planet, in this human life form. And so thank you for the question. And I feel like there's a very deep connection between spirituality and leadership. Another question: what is meant by how you show up? Thank you so much for that question, because my students always ask, what does she mean by this? And how can we develop this area of leadership? How we show up. In leadership jargon, we would say it's your executive presence. It's how you present yourself and how congruent that presentation is with who you are. I believe that our job, I mean, to me, those individuals that I consider great leaders or having a great leadership practice are individuals who show this alignment of integrity with their sense of self. So, how do you show up means, in my, what I mean by that is, how do you practice your leadership? How do you operationalize it? How is it exhibited? What is your behavior? That is what I mean by how you show up. And how can you develop this area? It begins with reflection, it begins with mindfulness, it begins with a spirit of inquiry, it begins with a questioning mind. I want you to be able to give yourself permission to question. I don't need answers. I need great questions. So, another question, and we've got just a few minutes left. Can you go more into the meaning of the question? How can my truth inform, not distort what I expect and experience? And how do you use the term expect here? So, how can my truth inform what I expect? So, one might also frame your truths as the assumptions you have about human beings, about the world, about life. And this goes back to Nitesh's question about spirituality. What do you believe? What matters to you? So what is your truth? So for example, my truth is that there is goodness in every human being. That is one of my truths. How does it inform what I can expect? When I meet a stranger, when I meet someone in the elevator for the first time, I'm entering with the assumption that this is a good human being, as opposed to being self-involved or negative or pessimistic or just fearing or fearful. I don't approach the world that way. And so that's what I mean. What do I expect? What do when I enter into a relationship? Imagine the work of teachers is to go into a classroom of 30, 40, 60 strangers at the beginning of every semester. I entered my class of women, culture, and leadership. It's a group of 60. I enter this room of strangers, and I'm going to be in relationship with them for 15 weeks. And so, what can I expect of them? Well, it depends on what my truth is. If I expect the best of myself, I expect the best of my students. I'm known infamously, I would say, at my university, at Soka University, for the phrase, do not waste my time. And I have to chuckle because when I use that phrase, usually around mid-semester, it's because individuals have shown up, they haven't prepared, they haven't done the reading. And I say to them, I do my best to be ready to enter this learning space with you every single week. And I would welcome your presence in that same preparation. So, what do I mean by expect? That's my expectations are based on my truths, and it's based on what I believe. So, I think we are just about out of time, and I'll just read a couple of questions. Is there a difference between knowledge and one's consciousness? Absolutely. I believe consciousness extends beyond knowledge. Consciousness connects to my heart. So for me, learning is head and heart connected. It is not just my head. So, yes. Next question. Can you help share the concept of power? How do you process that? Move them into seeing that it's not always negative. Quick response. I have this exercise. I bring in newspapers and I say, these are building products. And they're in groups of 4 or 5. And I tell my students, your job is to create a symbol of power. And for the first 30 seconds, nobody's breathing. And then they begin. And they have to consult, they have to talk. And guess what? Everyone within 7 minutes creates a symbol of power. And it's in that co-creation that a new understanding, a new perspective of power evolves. Global leaders, what points should we pay attention to in order to develop our listening skills? Practice not saying anything. Practice giving someone 3 minutes of your undivided attention. Just listen. So, how do we practice? Yeah, you've just got to do it. And the last one, in your experience as an educator, what resonates the most with you in relationships that you form with your students? Or what is the heart of those connections? And I'll close with this. Teaching is a privilege. And I'm going to get emotional here. I believe that today, teaching, the ability to teach, is a great responsibility that's been offered to me. And it really is a privilege. And so when I enter that learning space, it's with great humility. I go in not with advanced degrees and years of experience. I go in with an open heart, really with a sense of there's a room of global leaders in front of me. My job is to be able to make that happen, to allow their leadership potential to emerge. Thank you all so much. I wish I could see you all, but sending love to everyone. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of the conference. I'm just scrolling through the chat. Thank you all.